When I first came across the idea, it was just a random late-night internet scroll that got out of hand. I stumbled onto a forum for something called ghost dinners. The premise was simple. Host a gathering where one person isn't real. It was supposed to be a creative exercise, a blend of storytelling, group psychology, and lighthearted fun. Everyone brings a +1 who fits the theme of a ghost, someone invented but plausible. The trick is to make your ghost seem as real as possible without tipping anyone off. At the end of the night, everyone votes on who they think the ghost is, and if your ghost goes undetected, you win. I was hooked immediately. It had the perfect mix of mystery and mischief, and as someone who's always been a sucker for creative games, I decided I'd host my own ghost dinner. But, of course, I couldn't just leave it as a quirky little dinner party. No, it had to be perfect. I started planning everything down to the smallest detail. The seating arrangement, the menu, the lighting, even the playlist. I wanted it to feel like a surreal dinner where reality itself felt just a little slippery. The guest list was easy. I had my core group of friends, the kind who'd be down for something like this but wouldn't take it too seriously. There was Liz, who had a flair for the dramatic and would probably turn her ghost into some tragic backstory nightmare. Danny, the skeptic, would spend the whole night trying to pick apart everyone else's lies. Mia, the quiet observer, would take mental notes and blindside us with her insights at the last second. And Jack was the wild card. He wasn't the most dependable friend, but he was charming and unpredictable in a way that made him essential for this kind of night. Then there was Henry. Henry was my best friend, though even calling him that felt like underselling it. He was more like my shadow, always there, always reliable. He was the one who knew the embarrassing secrets I'd never tell anyone else, the one who stayed on the phone with me for hours during my worst breakups. Henry wasn't dramatic or chaotic or wild. He was steady. And that's why I didn't invite him. It sounds awful when I put it like that. But this night wasn't about steadiness. It was about chaos and deception and creating a bubble of suspended disbelief. Henry would have sniffed out my ghost in 2 seconds flat or, worse, refused to play along at all. I didn't want someone grounding the night in reality. I wanted it to float just above the surface of real, where you couldn't tell if the person next to you was lying through their teeth or baring their soul. I didn't tell him about the dinner. I figured he'd never know. Henry wasn't exactly the type to scroll Instagram or ask about my plans. And honestly, I didn't think he'd even care. The night of the ghost dinner arrived, and it was everything I'd hoped for. The table looked like something out of a dream. Long and candlelit, with soft, shadowy edges that made everyone look a little mysterious. The guests arrived, each introducing their ghost, with carefully curated stories. Liz's ghost was a childhood friend who'd gone off the grid for years after a messy divorce. Danny brought a coworker who supposedly worked in finance but had a suspiciously vague job description. Mia brought her cousin, a quiet man who sat at the far end of the table, contributing only a few cryptic remarks. Jack showed up late, as always, with a ghost who looked like she'd stepped out of a vintage postcard. He claimed she was an old family friend visiting from overseas, and she played her part so well I started to wonder if maybe she really was who she said she was. The energy was electric. Conversation turned into elaborate storytelling, and people kept trying to trip each other up with sly questions. I watched it all unfold with a kind of giddy pride. I'd created this strange, wonderful game where no one could trust what they were seeing or hearing. It felt like magic. Then, halfway through the main course, there was a knock at the door. At first, no one reacted. We were so deep in the game that the sound didn't even register. But then it came again, louder this time. I froze. I hadn't told anyone else about the dinner, and the door was locked. My heart raced as I stood up, murmuring an excuse about checking the kitchen. When I opened the door, Henry was standing there. "Hey," he said, his expression unreadable. "Can I come in?" I stared at him, my mind scrambling for an explanation. What are you doing here?" He held up his phone. Liz posted about this on her story. Figured it was a mistake that I wasn't invited. So, here I am. I wanted to scream. Of course Liz had posted something. Of course Henry had seen it. But the worst part wasn't that he'd shown up. It was the way he looked at me, like he already knew the answer to the question he hadn't asked yet. "Henry," I began, but he cut me off. "Don't worry," he said, stepping past me into the apartment. "I'll play along." I followed him back to the table, my chest tight with panic. Everyone greeted him with the kind of awkward politeness reserved for unexpected arrivals. Henry slid into an empty seat, folded his hands on the table, and smiled. "So," he said, his voice light but pointed, "who here is the ghost?" The game shifted instantly. The ease, the flow, the delicate tension I'd built all night. It fractured the moment Henry spoke. He didn't ask questions or tell stories. He just watched, listened. Everyone else suddenly seemed nervous, as if Henry's presence had tilted the scales and they didn't know how to adjust. By dessert, the night felt like it was hanging by a thread. We cast our votes, but no one even seemed to care about the results anymore. The air was too heavy. After everyone left, I started cleaning up in silence, avoiding the obvious. But Henry didn't leave. Finally, he spoke. "You didn't invite me because you thought I'd ruin it." I stopped wiping the table. "That's not." "Don't lie," he said, his voice quiet. "You wanted a night where everything felt unreal, and I don't fit into that. I'm too real for you." I turned to him, my stomach twisting. "Henry, it wasn't personal. I just wanted to keep things magical," he interrupted. "Sure, I get it. But the thing is, I would have gone along with it. I would have played your stupid game, because that's what friends do. But instead, you decided I didn't belong." I opened my mouth to argue, but nothing came out. He shook his head, gave me a small, sad smile, and walked out the door. It's been 2 weeks. I haven't heard from him, and I don't know how to fix it. Part of me still thinks I was right to keep him out, that the night wouldn't have worked with him there. But another part of me wonders if I've lost something more important than a game. AITA? The train station sat in the valley like a forgotten relic, its iron bones rusted and tired, as if it had been holding its breath for centuries. Most people passed through without a second thought, their hurried footsteps clanging against the old metal tiles. But every once in a while, someone noticed it. The faint hum in the air, like a violin string plucked too softly to hear, but strong enough to feel. I noticed it. That's why I couldn't stop coming back. It started 2 months ago, on a rainy Thursday when the kind of gloom that sticks to your skin was hanging heavy in the air. I was there for my usual commute, headphones in, eyes on my phone, pretending not to exist like everyone else. The train was late, as it often was, but this time something was different. A sound, or rather, the absence of one. The world seemed to hold its breath, and then it came. A low, melodic hum, like someone humming a lullaby in a language long forgotten. I turned my head instinctively, expecting to see someone, but the platform was empty except for the usual blur of strangers. That night, I couldn't sleep. The hum had wormed its way into my mind, looping like an unfinished thought. By the next morning, I'd convinced myself it was nothing, a trick of the rain or a faulty wire vibrating under the tracks. But when I returned to the station that evening, it happened again. This time, it was clearer, louder, and unmistakably deliberate. A melody, faint but certain, weaving through the noise of screeching brakes and distant announcements. The days blurred together after that. I started arriving earlier, staying later, trying to find the source of the sound. I wandered down the empty tunnels, my footsteps echoing against the cold, damp walls. I listened at every crack and crevice, chasing the music like a stray dog chasing a scent. The others on the platform began to notice me, side-eyeing my strange behavior, but I didn't care. I was certain the station was trying to tell me something, and I was determined to listen. It was on the 10th night, just as the last train rumbled away, that I saw her. A girl, no older than 15, sitting on the edge of the platform with her feet dangling over the tracks. Her dress was tattered, the hem stained with something dark, and her skin seemed almost translucent under the flickering lights. She was humming, her voice soft and haunting, the same melody that had been haunting me for weeks. "Hey," I called out, stepping closer. She didn't look up. Her head was bowed, her hair falling in a curtain around her face. "You shouldn't be here. It's dangerous." She stopped humming. For a moment, the silence was so complete I could hear my own heartbeat. Then she turned to me, her eyes meeting mine. and I realized they weren't eyes at all. They were mirrors, reflecting not my face but something deeper. Images of my past, my regrets, my failures. I staggered back, my breath hitching in my throat. "Why do you keep coming back?" she asked, her voice as quiet as the hum that had drawn me here. "Why are you chasing what you don't want to find?" What? The question caught me off guard. "I don't understand." "You're not supposed to." She stood, her bare feet making no sound against the metal tiles. "Not yet." "Wait," I said, reaching out instinctively. "Who are you? What is this? What's happening?" But she was already gone. One moment she was there, and the next, the platform was empty, save for the faint scent of lavender lingering in the air. I didn't sleep that night, or the next. The melody followed me everywhere, at work, in the shower, even in my dreams. I began to notice strange things. Shadows that moved when they shouldn't, whispers in empty rooms, the feeling of being watched. The station had changed too. The trains still came and went, but the air felt heavier, charged with an electric tension that made my skin prickle. The hum was constant now, louder and more complex, as if the station itself was alive and trying to speak. Then came the day it swallowed me whole. It was a Tuesday, the kind of day that feels like it's stuck in limbo, neither here nor there. I was waiting for the 8:15, the hum louder than ever, vibrating in my chest like a second heartbeat. The train roared into the station, its headlights cutting through the gloom, and as it passed, I saw her reflection in the windows. Her face, her mirrored eyes, staring back at me. Without thinking, I stepped forward. The train rushed past, the wind tugging at my clothes, but I kept walking. The platform seemed to stretch endlessly, the world blurring around me until there was nothing left but the hum and the faint scent of lavender. When I finally stopped, I was no longer in the station. I was in a place that looked like the station but wasn't. The walls were darker, the air colder, and the tracks stretched out into an infinite void. She was there, waiting for me. "You came back," she said, a hint of sadness in her voice. "I told you not to." "I don't understand," I said, my voice shaking. "What is this place? What do you want from me?" "It's not about what I want," she said. "It's about what you've lost." The mirrors of her eyes rippled, and suddenly, I was drowning in them. I saw everything. The choices I didn't make, the words I didn't say, the moments I let slip through my fingers. I saw my mother's face, smiling through her tears as she waved goodbye at the airport, not knowing it would be the last time we'd see each other. I saw the friend I'd pushed away, the love I'd let slip through my grasp, the life I'd abandoned in pursuit of something I couldn't even name. When it was over, I was on my knees, gasping for air. She knelt beside me, her voice soft. "This is what you've been running from. This is why you keep coming back." Tears streamed down my face, hot and bitter. "What am I supposed to do?" "Listen," she said, placing a hand on my shoulder. "The station is a crossroads. You can't go back, but you don't have to stay. The choice is yours." I looked up at her, at the mirrored eyes that had shown me everything I'd tried to bury. "And if I stay?" Her smile was sad but kind. "Then you become part of the hum." The night we decided to let the algorithm choose our fate started like any other. Me, sprawled on the couch clutching a half-empty bag of chips, and Logan, pacing like a caged animal, remote in hand, mumbling about how we've seen literally everything. It wasn't true, of course. The problem wasn't the lack of content, it was us. Logan wanted humor, lighthearted and stupid, something to make them forget the world existed. I wanted intensity, gritty dramas that left your brain spinning. Our tastes were like two parallel train tracks destined never to meet. Logan sighed dramatically, flopping into the armchair like a Shakespearean actor facing the cruel whims of fate. "We can't keep doing this, Frankie. I can't keep scrolling forever. My thumbs are tired." "Then pick something," I said, already knowing they wouldn't. "Every time I pick, you look at me like I've committed a war crime." "Because your choices are crimes, Logan. You made me sit through that show about the talking hamster detectives, remember? Hey, Hamster PI was underrated genius. You just don't get satire." I groaned and buried my face in the couch pillow. This argument had played out so many times it felt scripted. We were two people in a sitcom stuck in a plot line that wouldn't resolve. But tonight, Logan had a new idea. An idea that was either brilliant or catastrophic, with no middle ground. "We leave it to the algorithm," they said, holding the remote like a sacred artifact. No input from us. No browsing. Just one random pick. I looked at them, horrified. "That's chaos." "It's freedom," they countered, eyes gleaming with the kind of reckless excitement that usually got us into trouble. Before I could protest, Logan pressed the button. The screen blinked, the suggestion wheel spun, and we both leaned forward as the title materialized, The Umbra Station. The thumbnail was unsettling, a blurry silhouette standing under a flickering neon light. The description was even worse. An experimental docuseries that defies genre. Explore the mystery of the abandoned Umbra Station through found footage, interviews, and unexplained phenomena. "Nope," I said immediately, sitting back. "Hard pass." Logan grinned. "It's perfect. It's going to be weird and pretentious," I argued. "And probably boring." "Exactly," Logan said, as if that made sense. "It's something neither of us would pick, which means it's the ultimate compromise." They had a point, but I wasn't ready to admit it. Instead, I muttered, "Fine," and crossed my arms. Logan hit play. The screen faded to black, and then, faintly, a grainy video of an empty train platform flickered into view. A deep, monotone voice began narrating over ominous piano music. "Umbra Station," it intoned. "A place that shouldn't exist, and yet it does." The first 10 minutes were disjointed. Snippets of interviews with people claiming to have visited the station, blurry security footage, and static-filled audio recordings of something that sounded like whispers but wasn't quite words. It felt like someone had thrown a conspiracy podcast into a blender and added creepy visuals for flavor. I kept waiting for Logan to make a joke, to say something snarky, but they were oddly quiet, their eyes glued to the screen. By the halfway mark, the show had shifted gears. It wasn't just recounting strange stories about the station anymore. It was unraveling them. A woman claimed she'd walked through the station as a shortcut one rainy night, only to come out the other side 2 days later, disoriented and missing her shoes. A man swore he'd heard music playing, a haunting melody that followed him for weeks, even in his dreams. The interviews were intercut with eerie, slow-motion shots of train tracks disappearing into pitch-black tunnels. "This is so dumb," I whispered, though I couldn't look away. "Shoo," Logan hissed, leaning forward. "It's getting good." It wasn't good in the traditional sense. The pacing was weird, the visuals unsettling but nonsensical, and the narrators sounded like they were trying too hard to be cryptic. But there was something about it that crawled under your skin. Near the end of the episode, the screen went dark except for a single phrase in flickering white letters. "Stay tuned for the truth." Then the credits rolled. Neither of us moved for a while. Logan finally broke the silence. "So, next episode? I don't even know what we just watched." "Exactly," they said, their grin returning. "That's why we have to keep going." I groaned but didn't argue. Logan started the next episode, and I resigned myself to another round of weirdness. But as the second episode unfolded, something shifted. The random anecdotes and disjointed footage from the first episode started connecting in subtle ways. A name mentioned in passing during one interview reappeared as graffiti scrawled on a wall in another. The strange melody the man had described was faintly audible in a background scene. It wasn't just a documentary, it was a puzzle, and we were falling into it. By the fourth episode, we were hooked. Logan had their phone out, jotting down notes like a detective in a noir film. I was leaning forward, scanning every frame for details we might have missed. The show wasn't just pulling us into its story. It was pulling us into each other. Logan's wild theories about time loops and parallel dimensions collided with my insistence that it was all a metaphor for urban decay. We argued, laughed, and rewound scenes to dissect every detail. Then, halfway through the sixth episode, something happened. The screen glitched, just for a second, but long enough to make us pause. "Did you see that?" Logan asked, their voice unusually serious. "Yeah," I said, "probably just bad editing." But when we rewound, the glitch was gone. It was like it hadn't happened at all. We shrugged it off and kept watching, though I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. By the time we reached the final episode, the show had morphed into something unrecognizable. The interviews were gone, replaced by shaky handheld footage of someone exploring the abandoned station. The narrator's voice had vanished, replaced by muffled breathing and the faint sound of footsteps. Logan and I sat in silence, holding our breath as the camera moved deeper into the tunnels. The screen went black just as the footsteps stopped. There was a moment of dead silence, then a single phrase appeared, "You've arrived." The credits didn't roll. The screen stayed black, reflecting our stunned faces. Logan let out a nervous laugh. "Well, that was something." "Yeah," I said, though my voice sounded distant. That night, I dreamed of train tracks that stretched into infinity. When I woke up, Logan was already scrolling through forums, searching for theories about the show. They looked up as I stumbled into the kitchen. "So, did you dream about it?" "About what?" "The station." I froze. "Why would you ask that?" "Because I did." Logan's voice was quiet, and for once, they didn't look like they were joking. Neither of us brought it up again, but we both knew the algorithm hadn't just picked a show that night. It had picked us. The town was silent at midnight. A breath held too long. Dorian stood alone in the cobbled square, his shadow stretching long and thin under the flickering gas lamps. In his hands, he held the letter, crinkled and damp from the mist. It had arrived without a name or return address, only the seal of the order stamped in crimson wax. He hadn't seen that emblem in over a decade. Not since he'd left. Not since the fire. The instructions were simple. Come alone to the bell tower by midnight. Tell no one. Bring no weapons. Dorian had debated ignoring it. He'd even torn the letter in half and thrown it in the fire, but he hadn't been able to stop thinking about it. And now, here he was in the dead of night, staring up at the bell tower like a fool. He pulled his coat tighter around him and stepped toward the tower. The iron door groaned as it swung open, revealing a narrow staircase spiraling up into darkness. The air was cold, tinged with the metallic scent of rust. With a deep breath, he ascended, his boots echoing on the worn stone steps. At the top, the room was exactly as he remembered it. The massive bronze bell hung in the center, its surface tarnished but still majestic. Around it, windows gaped open to the night sky, the wind whistling through them like whispers. But what drew his attention was the figure standing in the shadows. "Dorian," a voice said, soft and lilting. He froze. He knew that voice. He'd dreamt of it for years, though he'd convinced himself those dreams were nothing more than guilt wearing a familiar face. "Alara," he whispered. She stepped into the light, and his breath caught. She looked the same as she had that night. Her hair a cascade of ink, her eyes like two shards of obsidian. But there was something off about her, something in the way she moved, too fluid, too deliberate. "You came," she said, her lips curving into a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Dorian's throat was dry. "You're supposed to be dead." Her smile widened, revealing teeth that were too sharp. "And yet, here I am." He took a step back, his hand instinctively reaching for the knife he'd promised not to bring. "What is this? Some kind of trick?" "No trick," she said, circling him slowly. "I wanted to see you. To talk." Dorian's chest tightened. "Talk about what?" "About the fire," she said, her voice softening. "About the order. About why you left me there." His stomach twisted. The memory of that night was a scar he carried, one he'd never been able to heal. The fire had consumed everything. The library, the archives, the people inside. And Alara. He had tried to save her, but the flames had been too fierce, the heat too unbearable. He'd barely escaped with his life. "I didn't leave you," he said, his voice hoarse. "I tried. You know I tried." "Do I?" she said, stopping in front of him. Her gaze bore into his, unblinking. "Because all I remember is the fire, the screams, and then nothing. Nothing for years." Dorian's hands shook. "Alara, Do you know what happens when you die, Dorian?" she interrupted, her tone cold and detached. "I do. I know what waits in the dark." And I know what it means to be dragged back. His blood ran cold. Dragged back? By who? She tilted her head, her smile returning, cruel and predatory. You wouldn't believe me if I told you. The air in the room grew heavy, pressing against his chest. He took a step back, his instinct screaming at him to run, but his legs wouldn't move. Alara, please. Whatever happened to you? I'm sorry. I didn't know. You didn't know, she snapped, her voice rising. The shadows in the room seemed to stretch toward her, writhing and pulsing like living things. You were part of the order, Dorian. You knew what they were capable of, what they were willing to sacrifice. He shook his head. I left because of what they did, because of what they made us do. I never wanted any of this. And yet, here you are, she said, her voice soft again, almost tender, drawn back to the tower like a moth to the flame. Why is that, Dorian? Guilt? Curiosity? Or is it something else? I don't know, he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. She stepped closer, and he could see the faint glow in her eyes, like embers smoldering in the darkness. Do you want to know the truth, Dorian? About the fire? About what really happened that night? He swallowed hard. Yes. She smiled, and the shadows around her surged, swallowing the light from the gas lamps. The room plunged into darkness, and Dorian felt a hand on his chest, cold and clawed. The fire wasn't an accident, she said, her voice echoing in the void. It was a purge. The Order knew too much, and they were willing to burn it all to keep their secrets. They left us there to die, Dorian. And they used you to do it. The words hit him like a blow, stealing the air from his lungs. No, he whispered. That's not true. I didn't. Didn't you? She said, her voice dripping with malice. Who lit the lanterns that night? Who locked the doors to the archive? Dorian's knees buckled. The memories he'd buried for years clawed their way to the surface, jagged and raw. He remembered the lanterns, the smell of oil, the way his hands had trembled as he turned the key. He hadn't known. He couldn't have known. Alara, I didn't mean to, he choked out. I didn't know what they were planning. But you did it, she said, her voice a whisper in his ear. You lit the fire. You sealed our fate. The shadows receded, and Dorian found himself on his knees, gasping for air. Alara stood over him, her expression unreadable. I came back for a reason, Dorian, she said. Not for revenge, not for answers, but to offer you a choice. What choice? He asked, his voice trembling. She extended her hand, her fingers still sharp and inhuman. Join me. Help me tear down the Order and everything they've built. Or refuse and face the consequences. Dorian stared at her hand, his mind racing. He thought of the Order, of the lives they'd destroyed, the secrets they'd kept buried. And he thought of Alara, twisted and changed by forces he couldn't comprehend. He reached out, his fingers brushing hers. The shadows surged again, and the world dissolved into darkness. Friday afternoon, I was ankle-deep in the backyard garden, wrestling a stubborn tomato plant that had decided to grow into the neighbor's fence. Dirt smeared across my face like war paint. My phone buzzed on the stone step where I'd left it. I ignored it at first, but when it buzzed again and again, I wiped my hands on my jeans and picked it up. It was a group call from my mom and my brother, Sean. Never a good sign. Hey, I said, trying to sound breezy. What's up? Sean's voice came first, loud and already exasperated. What's up? We're dealing with your mess, that's what's up. My mom chimed in before I could ask what he meant. Alex, honey, we need you to go pick up Grandpa's camper from the storage lot tomorrow. The reunion's Sunday, and someone forgot to arrange transport. Her voice was drenched in the sweet manipulation only mothers can pull off. I didn't forget, Sean snapped. I just didn't have time. I sighed and sank onto the garden step, my knees cracking. I can't. I've got plans tomorrow. What plans? Sean demanded. None of your business, I thought, but said, I've got the garden cleanup and… Oh, for the love of… Sean cut me off. The garden can wait, Alex. Grandpa's camper can't. You're the only one who has a hitch on their car. Sean, Mom scolded, but her voice was softer, like she agreed with him but didn't want to look bad. Honey, we know you're busy, but the reunion only happens once a year, and Grandpa really loves showing off his camper. I gritted my teeth. Here it was again, the same old dance. Me, the youngest and least complicated sibling, always expected to swoop in and save the day. Grandpa's camper? Not my problem. The family reunion? Not my circus. But every time, without fail, I'd end up playing the hero. I'm sorry, I said carefully, already bracing for the fallout. But I can't do it this time. Dead silence. You'd think I'd announced I was disowning the family. Alex, Sean said slowly, like he was trying to explain quantum physics to a toddler. You're seriously saying no? To Grandpa? I am, I replied, my voice steadier than I felt. You can figure it out. Rent a truck if you have to. You're being selfish, Sean snapped. This isn't about you. It's about family. And when does family ever give me a break? The words slipped out before I could stop them, and for once, the silence was mine. I hung up before either of them could respond. The next day, I didn't pick up my phone once. Instead, I threw myself into the garden with the kind of fury that might scare the plants into behaving. I hacked away at the overgrown mint patch and turned the soil until it felt like my arms would fall off. I didn't think about Grandpa's camper, or the reunion, or the text Sean had probably sent to the entire family group chat about my supposed betrayal. By late afternoon, I was so sore I could barely move. I collapsed into a lawn chair, sipping lemonade and admiring my work. My little garden finally looked peaceful. For once, so did I. Sunday rolled around, and predictably, the calls started early. This time it was my Aunt Carol. Alex, honey, your mom says you're not coming today. Everything okay? Everything's fine, I said, staring at the half-finished mural on the back wall of my shed. I just decided to sit this one out. Oh, she said, and then the pointed silence that followed was louder than any words. Well, I hope you're taking care of yourself. Grandpa will miss you, though. I thanked her and hung up. Guilt tugged at me, but I held firm. I'd already said no. There was no going back now. By Sunday evening, the post-reunion fallout began trickling in. My mom called, her voice carefully neutral. It was a nice day. Grandpa mentioned you a few times. He thought you'd be there to help with the camper. He mentioned me? Or you mentioned me? I asked, a little sharper than I intended. There was a pause. Well, it doesn't matter now. We managed. That should have been the end of it. But when Sean's message popped up in the family chat, guess who bailed on Grandpa and made us rent a truck? I couldn't resist firing back. Guess who assumed I'd drop everything to clean up their mess? I typed, fingers shaking. It was petty and immature, but it felt good. The group chat exploded, as expected. Accusations, defenses, backhanded compliments about all the times I'd helped in the past. And yet, when I finally put my phone down, I felt fine. No, better than fine. For once, I hadn't been sucked into the black hole of other people's chaos. For once, I'd chosen myself. Now, a few days later, I'm still wondering, did I do the right thing? Or did I just teach my family that I can't be counted on when it really matters? Maybe both are true. Maybe neither. AITA? It wasn't supposed to be anything special, just a routine visit to my Uncle Tim's lake house for the weekend. The kind of thing where you eat too many burgers, maybe go for a swim if the water isn't too cold, and listen to him drone on about how much better the world was before the internet. But this time, there was something new. Something I hadn't seen before. I noticed it when he was showing me and my sister Leah around the house, pointing out the little updates he'd made since last summer. Got a new dock installed, he said, puffing his chest out like he'd built it himself. And check this out, my pride and joy. He led us to his office, which wasn't much more than a cramped room with an old desk, a wall of bookshelves, and a deer head mounted above the window. But on the desk, sitting in a glass case, was the object that stole all my attention, a compass. It was old, antique old, with a tarnished brass casing and a face that looked hand-painted. The needle didn't spin like a normal compass. Instead, it quivered, pointing ever so slightly off-center no matter how Tim turned the case. What really caught my eye, though, was the inscription on the glass. It finds what you've lost. Where'd you get that? I asked, leaning closer. The glass had a faint smudge, like someone had pressed their thumb against it recently. Tim grinned, the kind of grin that meant he was about to tell one of his tall tales. Bought it from this guy at an estate sale. Said it was special, but, you know, people say a lot of things when they want your money. Still pretty cool, huh? Leah rolled her eyes. Special? It's just a compass. Tim waggled his eyebrows. Not just a compass. The compass. Legend says it can help you find anything you've lost. Keys, wallets, people. He trailed off dramatically, clearly loving his own theatrics. Of course, it's probably just junk, but it looks good on the desk, doesn't it? I couldn't take my eyes off it. There was something about the way the needle moved, slow and deliberate, like it was alive. Tim laughed at my fascination and waved us out of the room. Come on, don't stare too hard, kid. It won't do your homework for you. That night, while everyone else was watching a movie in the living room, I snuck back into the office. The door wasn't locked, and the compass was just sitting there, practically begging me to take it. I knew it was stupid. I knew Tim would notice it was missing, but curiosity got the better of me. I wanted to know if it worked. I wanted to know what it would show me. I slipped it out of the case, careful not to leave any fingerprints, and carried it upstairs to my room. For a while, I just sat there, turning it over in my hands. The brass felt warm, almost like it was alive, and the needle twitched whenever I moved it. Finally, I whispered, "Okay, show me. What have I lost?" The needle stopped quivering. It swung hard to the left, pointing toward the window. My heart raced as I followed it outside, across the yard, down the gravel path that led to the lake. The moon was bright enough to see by, casting silvery ripples over the water. I kept my eyes on the compass, letting it guide me. The needle didn't waver, even as I stepped onto the dock, and then it stopped, dead center, pointing straight down into the water. I crouched, peering into the lake, but all I saw was my own reflection. "This is stupid," I muttered, shaking the compass like a broken flashlight. But as I stood up to leave, I heard something, a faint, almost imperceptible voice calling my name. It wasn't Leah or Tim. It wasn't anyone I recognized. It was distant, muffled, like it was coming from under the water. I froze, heart pounding, and the voice came again, softer this time, almost pleading. "Please." I didn't think. I just jumped in. The water was freezing, the kind of cold that steals your breath and makes your limbs feel heavy. I swam toward where the compass had pointed, diving as deep as I could. The voice grew louder, clearer, the deeper I went. It wasn't calling my name anymore. It was crying. I saw it then, something glinting at the bottom of the lake. I reached for it, fingers numb and fumbling, and pulled it free. It was a small locket, the kind you'd see in a jewelry store window. But when I opened it, the pictures inside weren't of anyone I recognized. A man and a woman, smiling like they had the whole world ahead of them. The second I touched it, the voice stopped. The lake was silent, the water still. I swam back to the dock, clutching the locket, and hauled myself out. My clothes dripped as I stumbled back to the house, shivering and clutching the compass like a lifeline. The next morning, Tim noticed the compass was gone. At breakfast, he stormed into the kitchen, red-faced. "All right, which one of you jokers took it?" Leah blinked at him over her cereal. "Took what?" "The compass," he snapped. "It's missing, and I know one of you two did it." I couldn't lie. Not after what had happened. "I took it," I said, my voice shaking. "I just wanted to see if it worked." His face darkened. "And? Did it?" I held up the locket. His expression shifted, a mix of shock and something I couldn't place. "Where did you find that?" "In the lake," I said quietly. "The compass led me to it." He didn't say anything for a long time. Finally, he reached out and took the locket from my hand. His fingers trembled as he opened it, staring at the pictures inside. This belonged to my mother," he whispered. "She lost it years ago. Said it fell in the water when she was swimming." Leah and I exchanged a look. Tim never talked about his mother. He closed the locket and set it on the table, his hand lingering on it like it was the most fragile thing in the world. "You shouldn't have taken the compass," he said, his voice softer now. "But thank you." I nodded, unable to speak. The compass still sat in my lap, its needle quivering again. I knew I should give it back, put it back in its case and never touch it again. But part of me wondered what else it could find. What other things had been lost, waiting to be discovered. AITA? When we walked into the old antique shop, I didn't know we'd leave with a fish. Jake and I weren't even looking for a pet. We were looking for a lamp to replace the hideous one his cousin broke during a game of indoor frisbee. The place smelled like dust and forgotten memories, the kind of shop where every object felt haunted by a past life. I was sifting through a box of mismatched doorknobs when Jake called out to me, his voice tinged with an excitement I hadn't heard in weeks. "Hey, come look at this." I found him standing in front of a massive, ornate fish tank. It was clearly antique, with a frame of dark wood carved into twisting vines and leaves. Inside, the water shimmered like liquid light, even in the dim room, and floating in the middle of it was a single, impossibly vibrant fish. It wasn't any goldfish I'd ever seen. It was sleek and iridescent, its scales shifting colors as it moved. Green, then blue, then a deep, almost glowing purple. Its long fins trailed behind it like ribbons, moving in the water as if it were flying. The fish didn't dart around like the ones you'd see at a pet store. It floated, deliberate and calm, its large black eyes staring right at Jake. "It's a betta," I said, though I wasn't entirely sure. It looked different, otherworldly almost. But I've never seen one like this before. The old man behind the counter appeared suddenly, like he'd materialized out of the shadows. He was tall and thin, his suit about a decade out of fashion. "That's no ordinary fish," he said, his voice soft and gravelly. "It's an emberfin." I laughed. "What, is that supposed to mean something?" The man smiled, and it didn't quite reach his eyes. "It means it chooses its owner. Very particular, the emberfin." Jake's face lit up like he was a kid again. "I think it's choosing me," he said, pointing to the tank. Sure enough, the fish had drifted closer to him, its eyes unblinking and fixed on his face. I rolled my eyes. "You don't even like fish. You told me they're just water furniture." "Yeah, but look at it," he said, pressing his hand to the glass. It's mesmerizing." The old man chuckled. "It's meant to be, but I'll warn you, it's not the kind of pet you take lightly." Jake didn't hesitate. "We'll take it." I protested the whole drive home. Jake barely knew how to keep a houseplant alive, let alone a fish. "And what about the tank? Did it need filters?" He waved me off. "It'll be fine. We'll figure it out." But the strangest thing happened when we got back to the apartment. Jake set the fish's tank on the counter, and as soon as he let go, the shimmering water turned completely still. No ripples. No bubbles from whatever invisible filtration system the tank had. It was like the fish existed in a tiny, self-contained world, and it kept staring at him. For the first few days, Jake was obsessed. He'd sit by the tank for hours, watching the fish float and shift colors, talking to it like it could understand him. "I think it likes me," he said on the third night as we ate takeout on the couch. I snorted. "It's a fish, Jake. It doesn't have feelings." But secretly, I was starting to feel uneasy. The fish wasn't normal. I couldn't explain it, but every time I walked past the tank, I got this creeping sensation like I was being watched. Once, when Jake wasn't home, I tried sitting by the tank the way he did. I tapped on the glass lightly. The fish didn't move. It didn't even blink. Do fish blink? Its unrelenting stare made me shudder, and I backed away. Jake's obsession grew. He started coming home early from work to sit by the tank. He'd talk to the fish in hushed tones, like it was telling him secrets. He stopped playing video games, stopped watching movies with me. "You're ridiculous," I said one night. "It's a fish, not your soulmate." "You don't get it," he snapped, his eyes not leaving the tank. "It's not just a fish." That was when I started to notice changes in him, subtle at first. He stopped wearing his favorite hoodie because it felt wrong. He began eating less, claiming he wasn't hungry. And he started leaving the lights off in the apartment, saying the tank looked better in the dark. I chalked it up to stress at first. Jake worked long hours, and maybe the fish was just his weird way of decompressing. But then I caught him humming. Jake never hummed. He didn't even like music. But there he was, sitting by the tank, humming this low, eerie melody I'd never heard before. "What's that song?" I asked. He shrugged, his voice distant. "I don't know. I just know it." The fish started to change, too. Its colors grew brighter, more vivid, until it seemed to glow even without the lights on. Its fins grew longer, almost impossibly so, and they moved in a way that didn't make sense, like the water wasn't water anymore. One night, I swear I heard it whispering. I bolted out of bed, heart pounding, and found Jake sitting by the tank in the dark. "What are you doing?" I demanded. He didn't answer, just kept staring at the fish. The breaking point came a week later. I came home to find the apartment empty. Jake's phone was on the counter, but there was no sign of him. The fish was still in the tank, glowing brighter than ever, its eyes fixed on me. I grabbed my keys and headed out to search for him, but as I reached the door, I heard his voice. It was soft, coming from the tank. "Come here," it said. I froze. Slowly, I turned back. The fish was staring at me, and for the first time, I thought I saw something behind its black eyes, something vast and ancient, something that didn't belong in this world. "Where's Jake?" I whispered, my voice trembling. The fish didn't answer, but its glow pulsed, and in that moment, I understood. Jake wasn't coming back. The next day, I returned the tank to the antique shop. The old man didn't seem surprised to see me. "It happens," he said, taking the tank with a knowing smile. "The emberfin chooses, and sometimes, people can't let go." I didn't ask what that meant. I didn't want to know. But sometimes, late at night, I hear that low, eerie melody in my dreams, and I wonder if I'll ever see Jake again. AITA? When my Uncle Eli died last year, he left me his cabin upstate, a charming little place tucked away in the woods near a lake. I hadn't seen it since I was a kid, but I remembered it as magical, with smoke curling into the sky, fireflies flickering at dusk, and the creak of the old porch swing under the stars. Uncle Eli never married, so the cabin was his pride and joy. When the deed came in the mail, I cried a little. It felt like a piece of him, still alive. My family, however, reacted differently. My cousin Leah, who had never set foot in the cabin, suddenly had an opinion about it. "Eli always said I'd get the cabin," she claimed at Thanksgiving, a month after the funeral. "We used to talk about how perfect it would be for my retreats." Leah, a self-proclaimed yogi who couldn't touch her toes, was notorious for this kind of revisionist history. She'd always been the favorite, smart, gorgeous, effortlessly magnetic, and I knew her protests weren't about the cabin itself. It was about the fact that Eli had chosen me, the quiet one, the overlooked one. I brushed her off. The cabin was mine. It said so on the deed. The first time I visited as an adult, I went alone. The drive was longer than I remembered, winding through sleepy towns and unmarked roads. When I finally arrived, the cabin was smaller than I'd pictured, but it still felt like Eli's place. The porch swing was gone, replaced by a plastic lawn chair. A corner of the roof sagged ominously. Inside, it smelled of cedar and dust, and his old flannel jacket still hung on the coat rack. I stayed the weekend, patching a few holes in the walls and stacking firewood. It felt good to work with my hands, to be there, to belong. On Sunday, as I locked the door, I promised myself I'd make this cabin my own. When I got back, the text started. Leah, as always, was relentless. "What are you going to do with it?" she asked. "You're not seriously keeping it, are you? It's so impractical. You'll never have time to use it." She wanted it, of course, but instead of asking outright, she played the long game, planting seeds of doubt and waiting for them to sprout. "You know, I've been looking for a place to host my wellness workshops. It's exactly what I need." At first, I responded politely, explaining my plans to restore it, but her persistence wore me down. One day, she sent a particularly snarky message about how I'd never appreciate it the way Eli would have wanted, and I snapped. "Leah," I replied, "if Eli wanted you to have it, he would have left it to you. He didn't." End of story. That shut her up, for a week. Then came the idea of sharing the cabin. It was Leah's latest angle, and it wasn't just her this time. At a family dinner, she floated the concept to everyone. "We could all pitch in," she said. smiling as if the idea were completely selfless. Take turns using it. It's such a waste for one person to keep it all to themselves. She said this while looking directly at me, daring me to argue. My mother chimed in, eager to keep the peace. That might be nice, sweetheart. You wouldn't have to shoulder the upkeep all on your own. I wanted to scream. The cabin wasn't a timeshare. It wasn't a community project. It was a gift. My gift. But I bit my tongue and mumbled something non-committal, hoping the conversation would die. It didn't. By spring, the family had already made plans for the cabin without me. My aunt wanted to spend July there, to escape the city heat. My uncle joked about setting up his fishing gear. Leah, of course, claimed the best weekends for her yoga retreats. They hadn't asked for my permission. They'd simply assumed it was theirs to use. My annoyance simmered quietly, but I let it go. I told myself it wasn't worth the fight. Then came the weekend of the great incident. Leah and her friends showed up at the cabin unannounced. I found out because one of them posted a photo on Instagram. Leah, in a wide-brimmed hat, sipping rose on my porch. When I called her, furious, she acted like I was the one being unreasonable. Relax, she said. We're not hurting anything. Besides, I told you I needed it for my retreat. No, Leah, I said, trying to keep my voice calm. You told me you wanted it. I never agreed. She sighed, like I was a difficult child. You're being so territorial. It's just a cabin. Eli would have wanted us to share. I drove up that night, determined to kick her out. The place was a disaster. Empty bottles littered the porch. Someone had tracked mud across the floor, and the bathroom sink was clogged with hair. Leah was unapologetic. You're overreacting, she said, as her friends laughed nervously behind her. It's not like you even use this place that much. I'm the one who owns it, I snapped. You can't just show up whenever you want. Maybe you shouldn't own it then, she shot back. You're obviously not mature enough to handle it. That was it. I told her to pack her things and leave, and I didn't care if her friends had to camp on the side of the road. She stormed out, calling me every name in the book, and I locked the door behind her. That night, I sat alone in the cabin, seething, and made a decision. The next morning, I drove to town and found a locksmith. I had all the locks changed and installed a keypad with a code only I knew. Then I bought motion-activated cameras and set them up around the property. If Leah, or anyone else, tried to pull something like that again, I'd know. When I got home, the fallout was immediate. Leah told everyone I'd gone crazy and was hoarding the cabin like a psycho. My aunt called, begging me to reconsider. My mom left a voicemail asking why I couldn't just be generous. Even my dad, who usually stayed out of family drama, weighed in. Isn't it better to share than to fight? He said. Eli would have wanted us all to enjoy it. Maybe, but Eli had left it to me, not them. He trusted me to take care of it, to love it the way he had. And I did. The cabin was mine, not just legally but emotionally. It wasn't my fault they couldn't accept that. So here I am. Months later, still dodging passive-aggressive texts and awkward family dinners. I've made peace with my decision, but the question nags at me sometimes. Should I have let them use the cabin? Should I have been the bigger person? Or am I right to hold my ground? AITA? The night we decided to let the algorithm choose our fate started like any other. Me, sprawled on the couch clutching a half-empty bag of chips, and Logan, pacing like a caged animal, remote in hand, mumbling about how we've seen literally everything. It wasn't true, of course. The problem wasn't the lack of content, it was us. Logan wanted humor, lighthearted and stupid, something to make them forget the world existed. I wanted intensity, gritty dramas that left your brain spinning. Our tastes were like two parallel train tracks destined never to meet. Logan sighed dramatically, flopping into the armchair like a Shakespearean actor facing the cruel whims of fate. We can't keep doing this, Frankie. I can't keep scrolling forever. My thumbs are tired. Then pick something, I said, already knowing they wouldn't. Every time I pick, you look at me like I've committed a war crime. Because your choices are crimes, Logan. You made me sit through that show about the talking hamster detectives, remember? Hey, Hamster PI was underrated genius. You just don't get satire. I groaned and buried my face in the couch pillow. This argument had played out so many times it felt scripted. We were two people in a sitcom stuck in a plot line that wouldn't resolve. But tonight, Logan had a new idea. An idea that was either brilliant or catastrophic, with no middle ground. "We leave it to the algorithm," they said, holding the remote like a sacred artifact. No input from us. No browsing. Just one random pick. I looked at them, horrified. "That's chaos." "It's freedom," they countered, eyes gleaming with the kind of reckless excitement that usually got us into trouble. Before I could protest, Logan pressed the button. The screen blinked, the suggestion wheel spun, and we both leaned forward as the title materialized, The Umbra Station. The thumbnail was unsettling, a blurry silhouette standing under a flickering neon light. The description was even worse. An experimental docuseries that defies genre. Explore the mystery of the abandoned Umbra Station through found footage, interviews, and unexplained phenomena. "Nope," I said immediately, sitting back. "Hard pass." Logan grinned. "It's perfect. It's going to be weird and pretentious," I argued. "And probably boring." "Exactly," Logan said, as if that made sense. "It's something neither of us would pick, which means it's the ultimate compromise." They had a point, but I wasn't ready to admit it. Instead, I muttered, "Fine," and crossed my arms. Logan hit play. The screen faded to black, and then, faintly, a grainy video of an empty train platform flickered into view. A deep, monotone voice began narrating over ominous piano music. "Umbra Station," it intoned. "A place that shouldn't exist, and yet it does." The first 10 minutes were disjointed. Snippets of interviews with people claiming to have visited the station, blurry security footage, and static-filled audio recordings of something that sounded like whispers but wasn't quite words. It felt like someone had thrown a conspiracy podcast into a blender and added creepy visuals for flavor. I kept waiting for Logan to make a joke, to say something snarky, but they were oddly quiet, their eyes glued to the screen. By the halfway mark, the show had shifted gears. It wasn't just recounting strange stories about the station anymore. It was unraveling them. A woman claimed she'd walked through the station as a shortcut one rainy night, only to come out the other side 2 days later, disoriented and missing her shoes. A man swore he'd heard music playing, a haunting melody that followed him for weeks, even in his dreams. The interviews were intercut with eerie, slow-motion shots of train tracks disappearing into pitch-black tunnels. "This is so dumb," I whispered, though I couldn't look away. "Shoo," Logan hissed, leaning forward. "It's getting good." It wasn't good in the traditional sense. The pacing was weird, the visuals unsettling but nonsensical, and the narrators sounded like they were trying too hard to be cryptic. But there was something about it that crawled under your skin. Near the end of the episode, the screen went dark except for a single phrase in flickering white letters. "Stay tuned for the truth." Then the credits rolled. Neither of us moved for a while. Logan finally broke the silence. "So, next episode? I don't even know what we just watched." "Exactly," they said, their grin returning. "That's why we have to keep going." I groaned but didn't argue. Logan started the next episode, and I resigned myself to another round of weirdness. But as the second episode unfolded, something shifted. The random anecdotes and disjointed footage from the first episode started connecting in subtle ways. A name mentioned in passing during one interview reappeared as graffiti scrawled on a wall in another. The strange melody the man had described was faintly audible in a background scene. It wasn't just a documentary, it was a puzzle, and we were falling into it. By the fourth episode, we were hooked. Logan had their phone out, jotting down notes like a detective in a noir film. I was leaning forward, scanning every frame for details we might have missed. The show wasn't just pulling us into its story, it was pulling us into each other. Logan's wild theories about time loops and parallel dimensions collided with my insistence that it was all a metaphor for urban decay. We argued, laughed, and rewound scenes to dissect every detail. Then, halfway through the sixth episode, something happened. The screen glitched, just for a second, but long enough to make us pause. "Did you see that?" Logan asked, their voice unusually serious. "Yeah," I said. "Probably just bad editing." But when we rewound, the glitch was gone. It was like it hadn't happened at all. We shrugged it off and kept watching, though I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. By the time we reached the final episode, the show had morphed into something unrecognizable. The interviews were gone, replaced by shaky handheld footage of someone exploring the abandoned station. The narrator's voice had vanished, replaced by muffled breathing and the faint sound of footsteps. Logan and I sat in silence, holding our breath as the camera moved deeper into the tunnels. The screen went black just as the footsteps stopped. There was a moment of dead silence, then a single phrase appeared, "You've arrived." The credits didn't roll. The screen stayed black, reflecting our stunned faces. Logan let out a nervous laugh. "Well, that was something." "Yeah," I said, though my voice sounded distant. That night, I dreamed of train tracks that stretched into infinity. When I woke up, Logan was already scrolling through forums, searching for theories about the show. They looked up as I stumbled into the kitchen. "So, did you dream about it?" "About what?" "The station." I froze. "Why would you ask that?" "Because I did." Logan's voice was quiet, and for once, they didn't look like they were joking. Neither of us brought it up again, but we both knew the algorithm hadn't just picked a show that night. It had picked us. The first time we realized we had a problem was in aisle 7 of Greg's Discount Emporium, somewhere between the novelty piñatas and the industrial-sized tubs of bubble wrap. I was holding a giant inflatable flamingo. Ethan, my boyfriend, and the self-proclaimed voice of reason in our relationship, was holding a 6-foot-tall fake ficus tree. We were locked in a silent battle of wills, neither willing to let go of our chosen centerpiece for my sister Ivy's upcoming engagement party. The flamingo was objectively hilarious. It was pink, obnoxious, and came with a little crown you could Velcro to its head. Ethan's ficus, on the other hand, was tasteful, subtle, and exactly the kind of thing you'd expect to see in a dentist's office waiting room. "It's Ivy's engagement, not a bachelorette party," Ethan said finally, breaking the stalemate. "And what screams love and commitment like an inflatable flamingo?" I shot back, stroking the vinyl with mock reverence. "Nothing says romance like whimsy." "Whimsy?" He raised an eyebrow. "You mean chaos?" "Same thing," I said, unrepentant. Ethan sighed, long-suffering but not quite defeated. "We've been having versions of this argument all week. Ivy was my older sister, my childhood hero, and the only person I knew who could turn her passion for artisan bread-making into a thriving business. Her fiancé, Amir, was just as accomplished, a chef who could plate a salad so beautifully it made you question whether eating it was a crime. Together, they were like the golden couple of food Instagram, all candlelit dinners and matching aprons. Their engagement party was supposed to be an intimate garden gathering at their house, with a guest list small enough to fit around their antique dining table. A subtle, classy affair. At least, that was the plan. Until Ivy asked Ethan and me to organize it. The problem wasn't just that Ethan and I had different ideas about what constituted special. The problem was that we were both convinced our way was the right way, and neither of us could let go of the chance to impress Ivy. Ethan was team sophistication, with his color-coordinated decor ideas and carefully curated playlist of acoustic indie hits. I was team fun, pitching lawn games, bright colors, and a menu that included Amir's favorite guilty pleasure, dinosaur-shaped chicken nuggets. After the showdown at Greg's, we tried to compromise. Ethan agreed to let me keep the flamingo, but only if I promised to limit the rest of my whimsy to one additional element. I, in turn, agreed to help him iron the cloth napkins he'd bought for the table settings, even though the thought of ironing anything made me break out in hives. By the day of the party, the garden was a strange amalgamation of our combined efforts. Ethan had strung up fairy lights and set the table with hand-labeled place cards, while I'd set up a station for guests to build their own ice cream sundaes, complete with sprinkles and gummy bears. The flamingo, resplendent in its crown, presided over the snack table like a benevolent ruler. The party started smoothly enough. Ivy and Amir loved the decorations, and the guests seemed equally charmed by Ethan's elegant touches and my chaotic contributions. For a moment, I thought we'd pulled it off, and then the raccoons arrived. The first one appeared as Ivy was giving a toast. It ambled into the yard like it owned the place, sniffing at the snack table before attempting to climb onto the flamingo. Ivy froze mid-sentence. Is that a raccoon? Ethan looked at me, panic in his eyes. Why is there a raccoon? I shrugged helplessly. It's probably after the snacks. As if on cue, 2 more raccoons appeared, their beady eyes gleaming in the fairy lights. They were adorable, in a chaotic neutral sort of way, but the guests were less enthusiastic. A few people backed away nervously. Ivy, always unflappable, laughed and tried to shoo the raccoons away with a napkin. It didn't work. The raccoons, emboldened, knocked over the bowl of gummy bears and started a tug-of-war with the flamingo's crown. Ethan turned to me, his voice a mix of accusation and disbelief. This is your fault. The flamingo attracted them. How is this my fault? I shot back. You're the one who insisted on real cloth napkins. Maybe they smell like fabric softener. That doesn't even make sense. Before we could escalate into a full-blown argument, Ivy stepped in. Guys, she said, gesturing to the scene of utter chaos unfolding behind her, maybe we can focus on the raccoons? We spent the next 15 minutes trying to wrangle the uninvited guests. Ethan tried luring them away with breadsticks, while I attempted to corral them with a broom. One particularly brave raccoon made off with the flamingo's crown, retreating to a nearby tree as if to mock us. By the time we finally got the raccoons to leave, the party was in shambles. The tablecloth was stained, the flamingo was deflated, and the ice cream station looked like it had been hit by a tornado. Ethan and I slumped onto the grass, exhausted. Well, I said, breaking the silence, at least it was memorable. Ethan gave a weak laugh. Yeah, Ivy and Amir are never going to forget this. Ivy wandered over, a glass of wine in hand and a bemused expression on her face. You know, she said, sitting down beside us, this might be the best party we've ever had. Seriously? Ethan asked, incredulous. With the raccoons and everything? Ivy grinned. Especially because of the raccoons. It's so us. Chaos and fun, but with a little touch of class. You two nailed it. For a moment, Ethan and I just stared at her, then at each other. Maybe we hadn't ruined everything after all. Still, as I think about it now, I can't help but wonder. AITA for the flamingo? Or was Ethan the AITA for the napkins? It began with a sound. Not a loud one. Not one that anyone else seemed to notice. Just a faint click-click-click emanating from somewhere in the office ceiling. I first heard it while finishing up a late project. The place was nearly empty except for me, a few stragglers in IT, and the janitor pushing his squeaky cart down the hallway. The sound was soft but steady, like fingernails tapping on glass. I looked up, scanning the industrial grid of tiles above, but saw nothing unusual. Shrugging it off, I went back to work. The next day, it was louder. Or maybe it was just my imagination. By mid-afternoon, the click-click-click had settled into a rhythm, faint but unrelenting. This time, a few people commented on it. Air ducts, probably, muttered Carl from accounting. Building's old. I nodded, but something about the sound didn't feel mechanical. It felt deliberate. By the third day, the noise was driving me insane. I couldn't focus on spreadsheets or emails. I'd sit at my desk, staring at the ceiling, willing the sound to stop. Click. Pause. Click-click. It was irregular, like a message I couldn't decode. I wasn't the only one noticing now. Jenna from HR joked about ghost squirrels, while the IT guys suggested raccoons. Management said they'd call an exterminator, but nobody showed up. The real trouble began on the 4th day. I'd come in early, hoping to beat the noise to the punch. As soon as I entered the office, I felt it. A strange stillness, like the air was heavier than usual. The click-click-click was already there, louder and more erratic, as though it knew I was listening. I walked slowly to my desk, trying to pinpoint the source. That's when I saw it. On my desk was a sticky note I hadn't left. 3 words were scrawled across it in jagged handwriting. It's watching you. I froze. My first instinct was to laugh, but it came out wrong, sharp and hollow. Very funny, guys, I called out, but no one answered. The office was empty, the lights dimmed except for the ones near my desk. I crumpled the note and tossed it in the trash, but my hands wouldn't stop shaking. By the time everyone else arrived, I'd almost convinced myself it was a prank. Someone must have seen me staring at the ceiling and decided to mess with me. Carl? Jenna? Even Adam, who rarely spoke but had a talent for Photoshop and mischief. The possibilities spun in my head as the day wore on, but no one gave me so much as a sideways glance. If it was a joke, they were committed. At lunch, I decided to get some air. The cafeteria was too noisy, the clatter of trays and buzz of conversation making the clicking feel like a drumbeat in my skull. I grabbed my sandwich and headed to the stairwell, a quiet spot I sometimes used when I needed to think. As I reached the top landing, I saw another sticky note stuck to the door. "Do not open," it read. My stomach twisted. This wasn't funny anymore. Ignoring the warning, I pushed the door open. The rooftop was empty, bathed in a pale winter sun. The wind whipped against my face, making my eyes water. I scanned the space, half expecting to see someone hiding behind the AC unit. But there was nothing. Just me and the endless stretch of sky. As I turned to leave, I noticed something glinting on the ground near the door. A small, silver key. I picked it up, turning it over in my hand. It was unremarkable, just an ordinary key with no markings or tags. For reasons I couldn't explain, I slipped it into my pocket. The clicking followed me back downstairs, louder now, almost frantic. My coworkers seemed oblivious, typing away or chatting about weekend plans. I felt like I was slipping into a different reality, one where only I could hear the sound, see the notes, feel the weight of the key burning in my pocket. That evening, as the office emptied out, I stayed behind, determined to solve the mystery. I climbed onto my desk and pushed aside a ceiling tile. Dust rained down and I sneezed, but I didn't stop. I shone my phone's flashlight into the dark void above, half expecting to see wires or pipes. Instead, I saw a small, wooden box nestled between the beams. Heart pounding, I reached for it, my fingers brushing against the rough surface. The box was no bigger than a shoebox, painted black with faint symbols carved into the sides. It felt wrong, like holding something alive. My instinct screamed at me to leave it, to put the tile back and pretend I hadn't found it, but curiosity won out. I climbed down and placed the box on my desk. There was no lock, just a simple clasp that felt ice cold to the touch. Slowly, I opened it. Inside was a photograph, yellowed with age. It showed a group of people standing in front of a building that looked eerily like our office. Their faces were blurred, smudged beyond recognition, but their postures were rigid, as though they'd been caught in a moment of panic. Beneath the photograph was another sticky note. "You shouldn't have." The lights flickered. The click-click-click stopped abruptly, leaving a silence so heavy it pressed against my ears. Then, from somewhere deep in the office, I heard footsteps. They were slow, deliberate, growing louder as they approached. I couldn't move. The air felt thick, my limbs frozen in place. The footsteps stopped just outside the reach of my desk lamp's glow. "Who's there?" I managed to croak, my voice barely above a whisper. No answer, just silence. I grabbed the photograph and the box, shoving them back into the ceiling as quickly as I could. I slammed the tile into place and scrambled down, my pulse hammering in my throat. The footsteps didn't move, didn't retreat. They just lingered, as though waiting for something. For me. I didn't sleep that night. The click-click-click followed me home, faint and distant but unmistakable. The silver key sat on my nightstand, gleaming in the moonlight. I wanted to throw it away, to toss it into the river or bury it somewhere no one would find it, but some part of me couldn't let go. The next day, I called in sick. My coworkers texted me updates, saying the exterminator had finally come and found nothing unusual. The clicking was gone, they said. The office was back to normal, but I knew better. The sound wasn't gone. It was here, with me, waiting. The trouble started with the ice cream truck. Our office was on the third floor of a nondescript brick building, overlooking a parking lot that doubled as the home base for a food truck battleground. There were taco trucks, a rotating cast of barbecue rigs, even a falafel van with questionable hygiene. But the real star was the ice cream truck, a cheerful, pastel-painted beast that parked outside every day at exactly 2:30 p.m., playing the same tinny rendition of Pop Goes the Weasel on an endless loop. It drove my coworker Lucas absolutely insane. Lucas wasn't the kind of guy who handled distractions well. He wore noise-canceling headphones for everything. Typing, phone calls, even when the air conditioner hummed a little too loudly. "That truck," he muttered to me one day, glaring out the window as the jingle wafted up. "It's psychological warfare." "It's ice cream, Lucas," I replied, licking a melting strawberry cone I just bought. "It's supposed to make people happy." "Happy?" he snapped, his face turning the shade of a traffic cone. "That sound is engineered to make children whine, parents spend money, and adults like me lose their damn minds." At first, I laughed it off. Lucas had a flair for melodrama, and I figured he'd adapt or drown himself in white noise. But the next day, he brought earplugs. By the end of the week, he'd petitioned HR to file a noise complaint against the truck. When that failed, because honestly, how do you legally evict an ice cream truck? He declared war. And because I happened to sit in the cubicle next to him, I was drafted into his crusade. It started small. Lucas emailed the truck owner, pretending to be a concerned parent worried about hearing damage from excessive jingles. No reply. Next, he tried bribing the taco truck owner to park in the ice cream truck's usual spot. This only resulted in a parking lot shouting match that ended with the taco truck being moved one row over, leaving the ice cream truck triumphant. Lucas was furious. I thought it was hilarious. Until the escalation started to affect me. One afternoon, I noticed Lucas had rigged a small speaker under his desk. Every time the ice cream truck jingle started, he'd blast a counter melody, something equally obnoxious, like polka music or off-key kazoo recordings. "Fighting fire with fire," he said, grinning like a man who just invented chaos. It worked, in the sense that the rest of the office hated him now. Our manager, Sheila, pulled him aside and told him to cut it out. Lucas did, for a day. But when the truck showed up again, louder than ever, Lucas retaliated by placing an order for 200 ice cream sandwiches under a fake name and then filming the driver's confusion when no one came to pick them up. The truck driver, a wiry man named Gene, was not amused. I watched from the window as he stared up at our office building, his squint turning into a glare. When I looked back at Lucas, he was holding a whiteboard with the words, "Turn it OFF," scrawled in black marker, pressed dramatically against the glass. Gene responded by parking an hour earlier the next day. The jingle started at 1:30 p.m. Lucas nearly flipped his desk. "He's targeting me," he hissed, pacing between our cubicles like a caged animal. "This is personal now." To my surprise, he was right. Gene began adjusting his schedule daily, shifting the time he parked outside so Lucas could never predict when the jingle would start. Once, he even played it in reverse, a distorted, haunting melody that sounded like the soundtrack to a cursed doll movie. Lucas responded by sending Gene anonymous letters stuffed with printed-out research on noise pollution and stress levels. Gene responded by switching to an air horn every time he left the lot. I tried to stay neutral, but it was impossible. Lucas's obsession was contagious. Soon, I was helping him brainstorm sabotage ideas during lunch. We considered everything from fake Yelp reviews to hiring a mariachi band to drown out the jingle. Ultimately, Lucas settled on a less creative but equally effective tactic. He bought a universal remote that could mute outdoor speakers and spent an entire week standing in the parking lot, waiting for Gene to notice the sudden silence. Gene noticed. The next day, the truck arrived with a new jingle, Baby Shark. Lucas didn't come to work the next morning. He called in sick, his voice hoarse from what I can only assume was hours of screaming into his pillow. Gene, emboldened, started adding decorations to the truck. Balloons shaped like musical notes, flashing lights that pulsed in sync with the jingle, even a giant inflatable cone on the roof. Lucas returned the following week with a PowerPoint presentation titled, "The Enemy Among Us: How the Ice Cream Truck is Destroying Workplace Productivity." He presented it to Sheila, who laughed so hard she had to excuse herself from the meeting. The feud reached its breaking point during the office summer picnic. Gene, sensing an opportunity, parked his truck right at the edge of the park where we were grilling burgers and playing tug-of-war. He handed out free samples to the kids, all while making aggressive eye contact with Lucas. I could practically see steam coming out of Lucas's ears. That night, Lucas dragged me into his scheme. "We're breaking him," he said, brandishing a bag of industrial-grade magnets. If we put these on his speakers, it'll distort the sound. He won't be able to play that infernal jingle anymore. I knew it was a bad idea, but I'd been dragged too deep into the madness to back out. At 10 p.m., we snuck into the lot where Gene parked the truck overnight. The plan was simple: attach the magnets, leave, and deny everything if questioned. But as Lucas approached the truck, flashlight in hand, the floodlights turned on. A siren blared. Gene stepped out from behind the truck, holding what looked like a water balloon launcher. "You think I didn't know it was you?" he shouted, his voice carrying across the empty lot. "This truck is my livelihood, you lunatic." Lucas froze, then bolted. I followed, laughing so hard I could barely run. Gene chased us for a block before giving up, his muttered threats fading into the night. The next day, Gene wasn't in the parking lot. For the first time in months, it was quiet. Lucas basked in his victory, though he looked a little too smug for someone who'd been outmaneuvered at every turn. But when the ice cream truck returned a week later, it was different. The jingle was gone. Instead, Gene stood outside the truck with a small portable speaker and a megaphone. Every time Lucas looked out the window, Gene would press play on the speaker, blasting the jingle manually, while shouting into the megaphone, "This one's for you, buddy." Lucas put in his 2-week notice the following day. When I asked why, he just muttered, "He won," and started packing his desk. Gene celebrated by offering the office free ice cream for a month. I still can't eat strawberry cones without hearing, "Pop goes the weasel." AITA? The agreement was simple: share the basement. The house we rented wasn't huge, but it had the perk of a finished basement, complete with an old fireplace and enough space for both me and Ezra, my best friend and now reluctant housemate, to coexist. Ezra called dibs on the left side for his studio. He's an artist, the abstract. Is this supposed to be a tree or a man screaming? Kind. And I took the right for my woodworking projects. It felt like a good balance. I liked order. He liked chaos. Maybe we'd balance each other out. At first, it worked. Ezra would be on his side with his easel and his paints, blaring the kind of jazz that sounds like a car accident, while I worked on my shelves and tables to the steady hum of my sander. We'd pass beers back and forth and crack jokes about how the basement smelled like turpentine and sawdust. But then, the red chair happened. Ezra found it on the curb, a beaten-up relic with cracked legs and peeling upholstery. "This chair," he declared, dragging it into the basement with dramatic flair, "is going to be my masterpiece." I shrugged and went back to sanding a table leg, assuming he'd either fix it up or forget about it like he did with most of his finds. But weeks passed, and the chair stayed on the line. Our line, the invisible boundary between order and chaos. At first, I nudged it toward his side, thinking it was a harmless gesture. The next day, it was back on the line, perfectly centered, as though Ezra had measured it down to the millimeter. "Seriously, Ezra," I said, pointing at the chair one night, "you're crowding my workspace." "Crowding," he said, smirking. "It's called artistic tension. The chair belongs where it inspires. It belongs where it doesn't get in the way of my projects." That was the first crack in our basement détente. I moved the chair to his side again, this time far enough back that it almost bumped his easel. The next day, it was back on the line, but now it was turned slightly, like it was staring at me. The tension escalated. He began leaving his paintbrushes on my workbench. I started stacking my scrap wood dangerously close to his canvases. He'd borrow my clamps without asking, and I'd rearrange his paint tubes in the wrong order. The basement, once a productive if messy space, became a minefield of petty battles. Then Ezra got weirder. It started with the chair. One morning, I found it draped in a tarp, which wasn't unusual. He'd been priming it the night before. But there was something off about the way the tarp hung. It wasn't until I peeked underneath that I realized he'd rigged some kind of mechanism inside the chair's frame. "What is this?" I asked, holding up a bundle of wires I'd pulled from its undercarriage. "An experiment," Ezra said, his face completely straight. "With what? Electrocution?" He rolled his eyes. "It's kinetic art. It's supposed to react to its surroundings." "What surroundings?" I snapped. "It's a chair. It belongs in a dumpster." He didn't respond, just turned up his jazz and went back to splattering paint on a canvas. But the chair did start reacting. One night, while I was in the basement sanding a new project, I heard a faint creak. I turned, and the chair was rocking slightly, as though someone had just stood up from it. The basement was drafty, sure, but this was different. The rocking was rhythmic, deliberate. I walked over, gave the chair a nudge, and it stopped. When I turned back to my work, it started again. "Ezra," I said the next morning over coffee, "your chair is haunted." He looked up from his sketchbook, unimpressed. "It's not haunted. It's sensitive." "Sensitive to what? Bad vibes?" He smirked. "Maybe it doesn't like being pushed around." From then on, things got stranger. I'd leave the basement and return to find my tools missing, only to discover them on the chair's seat, arranged in eerie precision. Once, I found a jagged strip of my sandpaper woven into the upholstery. When I confronted Ezra, he just shrugged and said, "It's adapting." Adapting to what? Then came the night of the flood. A pipe burst in the basement while we were both out. When we got back, the place was a mess. Water pooling everywhere. My project soaked, his canvases curling at the edges. We scrambled to move everything to higher ground. When I grabbed the chair to haul it upstairs, it felt heavier than it should have been. Something rattled inside. "Ezra, what the hell is in this thing?" I demanded, prying open the bottom. "Leave it," he said, suddenly serious. "No way. If this thing's full of water, it's just going to ruin the floor." Before he could stop me, I yanked the chair over and tore open the base. Inside was a tangle of wires, shards of glass, and, strangest of all, a small, black box faintly humming. "What is this?" I asked, holding it up. Ezra froze, his face pale. "It's part of the experiment. This isn't art, Ezra. It's a fire hazard." "It's more than art," he snapped. "You wouldn't understand." "You're right," I said, tossing the box onto the pile of soaked wood. "I don't understand why you're turning this place into a science fair from hell." That night, the basement stayed dark. I stayed upstairs, angry, while Ezra brooded in his room. By the next morning, the chair was gone. Ezra claimed he took it to a gallery. "It was time to move on," he said, but something in his voice didn't sit right. The basement felt emptier without it, but not in a comforting way. I didn't ask where he took it. I didn't want to know. But sometimes, late at night, I hear a faint creak coming from the basement, and when I go down there, there's nothing on the line but a faint pink glow, as though the chair never really left at all. "AITA?" The argument started over an umbrella. Not a fancy one. Not one with sentimental value. Just a cheap black umbrella with a slightly bent frame and a handle that squeaked when you opened it. If you had asked me that morning, I would have said it wasn't worth more than $5. By the end of the day, it felt like the most valuable thing in the world. Or at least the most dangerous. It was my brother Nate's umbrella, though I didn't know that when I grabbed it from the stand by the door. It was pouring rain, the kind of relentless downpour that makes you regret every life choice leading up to forgetting your jacket. I was already late for work and had zero time for a scavenger hunt, so I grabbed the first umbrella I saw and bolted out the door. It wasn't until I got to the bus stop that I noticed the duct tape near the tip. Nate's signature fix-everything solution. I told myself he wouldn't miss it for one day. What was the big deal? The big deal arrived later that night, in the form of Nate slamming the front door and yelling, "Where's my umbrella?" I was on the couch, halfway through a bag of chips and a true crime documentary, and I barely looked up. "Relax, I borrowed it. It's by the door." "You borrowed it?" His voice was an octave higher than usual, like I'd told him I'd sold his car. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" I paused the TV, frowning. "I used it for, like, an hour. It's not even raining anymore." He stormed over, grabbed the umbrella, and examined it like a doctor diagnosing a patient. "Do you know what this is?" "An umbrella?" I said, confused. "This isn't just an umbrella," he hissed, lowering his voice like he thought the walls might be listening. "This is... Look, it's complicated, but let's just say it's not normal." I blinked at him. "Not normal? Are you seriously telling me your umbrella is special?" "Yes," he snapped. "And now you've... Oh my God, did you open it?" I stared at him, wondering if he was messing with me. Of course I opened it. That's literally what umbrellas are for. His face went pale, and he sat down heavily on the armrest of the couch. You don't get it. This isn't a regular umbrella. It's... Look, I didn't want to drag you into this, but you might have activated it. Activated it? I repeated, laughing. What? Does it shoot lasers? Turn into a parachute? Come on, Nate. What's the deal? He rubbed his temples, clearly regretting every decision that had led him to this moment. It's a long story, but fine. You want to know? The umbrella, it's a key. I raised an eyebrow. A key to what? He hesitated, then muttered, to a pocket dimension. I burst out laughing. Oh, come on. Is this one of your weird D&D stories? Did you leave your dice in there too? I'm serious, he snapped, standing up and pacing the room. I found it a few years ago in this antique shop. The owner said it was cursed, but I thought she was just trying to up the price. Then weird things started happening when I opened it. Lights flickering, random voices, objects disappearing. I figured out it's connected to something else, something not from here. I stared at him, my laughter fading. He looked deadly serious, but that didn't mean anything. Nate had always been a bit dramatic, prone to overthinking and conspiracy theories. Okay, I said slowly. Let's say I believe you. What does this have to do with me using it for 5 minutes? Because opening it makes a connection, he said. And now whatever's on the other side knows you exist. Knows I exist? I repeated. What does that even mean? What's on the other side? He shook his head, looking genuinely spooked. I don't know exactly. Shadows, mostly. Sometimes shapes. I've heard whispers, but I've never seen them. They don't like being seen. All I know is, they've never followed me here. But if they're aware of you... I rolled my eyes. Nate, you've officially lost it. It's an umbrella. I used it. Nothing happened. End of story. As if on cue, the lights flickered. I froze, my heart skipping a beat, but I forced a laugh. Coincidence. Nate didn't look convinced. You've got to take this seriously. Did anything weird happen while you were out? No, I said quickly, but then I remembered something. A man at the bus stop had been staring at me. Not in the normal, why isn't this person looking at their phone way, but in a sharp, predatory way that made the hairs on my neck stand up. When the bus came, he didn't get on. He just kept standing there, staring. I shook my head. No, nothing happened. Nate narrowed his eyes. You're lying. Even if I was, how would that prove anything? I shot back. You're making a mountain out of a molehill. Just admit you're upset I borrowed your stuff and let it go. He didn't respond, just kept staring at the umbrella. The room felt colder somehow, and I noticed the faintest shadow moving in the corner of my eye. When I turned to look, nothing was there. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every creak of the house felt louder, every shadow longer. I kept the umbrella in my room, more to spite Nate than for any practical reason, but it felt heavy, like it was watching me. At 3 a.m., I finally gave in and opened it again, just to prove to myself that nothing would happen. At first, it was just an umbrella, but then the air around me shifted, thick and electric. Like the moment before a storm, a low hum filled the room, and the shadows on the walls seemed to ripple. I slammed it shut and shoved it under my bed, my heart racing. The next morning, Nate didn't say, "I told you so," but the look on his face when I handed him the umbrella said it all. Now we barely speak. I don't know if he was right about the umbrella or if my mind played tricks on me, but sometimes I catch flickers in the corner of my vision, like something's watching me. AITA? It started with a simple, harmless question. If you could go anywhere in the world, where would it be? We were sprawled out on the rug in our living room, each with a mug of tea, the winter wind rattling the windows. I asked it without much thought, just trying to fill the comfortable silence. But Alex didn't answer right away. Instead, they turned their mug in their hands, staring at the swirling steam like they could divine the perfect answer from it. I don't know, they said eventually. Somewhere quiet. Somewhere simple. Simple? I asked, trying to mask my disappointment. Like what? A beach? Sure, they said, a little defensively. A beach. Or a cabin. Somewhere where nothing happens. I couldn't help but laugh. Somewhere where nothing happens. That's not a vacation. That's just existing in a different location. And what's wrong with that? Alex shot back, their tone sharper than I expected. Not every trip has to be some epic quest. Epic quest? I repeated, grinning despite myself. Are you calling my idea of a vacation a quest? Because I'll take it. Let's go full-on Lord of the Rings. I'm talking mountain hikes, ancient ruins, maybe even a cave or two. Alex rolled their eyes but didn't smile. You know what I mean. You always want these big, adventurous trips. You want to climb mountains and kayak with whales and dive into caves. I just want to rest for once. To actually breathe. That gave me pause. I wasn't oblivious to how hard Alex worked, how their job chipped away at them like waves on stone. But rest wasn't what I needed. The world felt huge and fleeting, and every chance to see it felt like a race against time. I didn't want to sit still. I wanted to devour the horizon. So what? I said, trying to keep my tone light. We're supposed to just sit on a beach for a week? Stare at the ocean and sip cocktails? Alex shrugged. What's so bad about that? At least it's peaceful. I shook my head. Peaceful is boring. An adventure is exhausting. They shot back. We let the conversation drop after that, both of us retreating into our thoughts. But the disagreement lingered, circling like a vulture over our plans. Neither of us wanted to back down, and neither of us wanted to push the other into something they'd hate. It was a stalemate, one I wasn't sure we could break. That night, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, replaying the conversation in my mind. I couldn't stop thinking about Alex's face when they said the word breathe. There was a weariness there, a quiet desperation that made me feel guilty for brushing off their idea of rest. But I also couldn't shake the image of the trips I'd always dreamed of, the ones where every moment felt alive, where I could finally feel like I was living up to the potential of the world. The next day, I proposed something ridiculous. What if we let chance decide? Alex looked up from their laptop, confused. What do you mean? I said, sitting down across from them. What if we pick a place neither of us has ever thought of? Something totally random. That way, it's not about your idea or mine. It's about finding something new together. They raised an eyebrow. How do you even pick something random? I don't know, I admitted. A dartboard? A random map generator? We spin a globe and point? Alex considered this, their fingers tapping lightly on the edge of the table. Finally, they said, okay, but if we end up in the middle of nowhere, it's on you. 2 hours later, we were standing in front of my old, slightly battered globe. I gave it a spin, and Alex closed their eyes, dramatically extending one finger. When the globe stopped, they peeked at their choice and groaned. Seriously? The Azores? I laughed. Hey, it could have been worse. The Azores are amazing. Volcanic islands, hiking trails, and, wait for it, beaches. Beaches, Alex said flatly. Plural? Yes, I said, grinning. And volcanoes. We both win. A month later, we were on a tiny plane, descending toward a cluster of emerald islands surrounded by endless blue. The Azores looked like something out of a storybook, with jagged cliffs, rolling green hills, and little villages that seemed untouched by time. I could see Alex relaxing the moment we stepped off the plane, the tension in their shoulders melting in the warm, salty air. The first few days were slow, even for me. We stayed in a little cottage near the coast, where Alex spent hours lying in a hammock, reading a novel I'd never seen them touch at home. I tried to relax too, but my restless energy kept pulling me toward the horizon. Go, Alex said one morning, catching me staring at a distant peak. You're itching to explore. I'll be here when you get back. So I went. I hiked through forests of twisted trees and up trails that wound around volcanic craters, the views so staggering I almost forgot to breathe. When I came back that evening, sunburned and exhilarated, Alex was waiting on the porch with a bottle of wine and a satisfied smile. You look happy, they said, pouring me a glass. I am, I admitted. But I missed you. They laughed. I think you missed the wine. The next day, I convinced Alex to join me on a short hike to a hot spring nestled in the hills. They grumbled the whole way up, muttering about blisters and bugs. But when we reached the spring, their eyes lit up. "This," they said, slipping into the steaming water, "I can get behind." By the end of the trip, we'd found a rhythm. Some days were quiet and slow, with long stretches of beach and lazy afternoons. Other days were wild and exhilarating, full of cliffside trails and hidden waterfalls. It wasn't exactly what either of us had envisioned, but it felt like something better, like discovering a new side of each other and of ourselves. On our last night, we sat on a cliff overlooking the ocean, the stars scattered like sequins across the sky. Alex leaned against me, their head on my shoulder, and sighed. "Maybe you're right," they said softly. "Maybe adventure isn't so bad." "And maybe," I said, kissing the top of their head, "rest isn't so boring." The breeze carried our laughter out to sea, and for the first time, I realized we'd found exactly what we were looking for. Something we didn't even know we needed. A middle ground. A place where adventure and peace could coexist. A place where, for a little while, we could just be.